The first light of dawn was just beginning to spill across the rooftops of the quiet neighborhood in Asheville, North Carolina, as Clara Vance stirred in her tiny kitchen. The house was small, carrying the subtle sense of dark roast coffee brewing and white bread toasting on the skillet. Ever since her father passed away 3 years ago from a sudden illness, this quiet morning ritual had become Clara's way of holding the family together. Her father used to tell her that a home was never defined by the square footage of its floorboards, but by the warmth of the people who gathered around its table every single morning. Clara plated the modest breakfast just as he used to do, ensuring everything was placed with intentional care. "Mom, breakfast is on the table," Clara called softly toward the hallway, adjusting her crisp scrub uniform before pulling her dark hair back into a neat tie. Her mother, Sarah, stepped slowly out of the hallway, leaning heavily on her cane as her knees groaned with arthritis. She paused at the kitchen archway, watching her eldest daughter organize the space with rhythmic precision. "Sweetheart," Sarah murmured softly, taking her place at the wooden table, "one of these days, you need to start thinking about yourself instead of carrying all of us on your shoulders." Clara leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to her mother's forehead, feeling the delicate warmth of her skin. "You guys come first," Clara replied, with a small, reassuring smile that did not quite reach her tired eyes. "Everything else can wait." Sarah looked at her daughter, her gaze filled with a mixture of immense pride and deep heartache. "Your father would be so proud of the woman you've become, Clara." Clara lowered her eyes toward the coffee pot, swallowing the lump in her throat before answering quietly, "I just wish he were still here to tell me that himself." Before the silence could settle too heavily, the old landline phone on the wall chimed loudly. It was the vice principal from the local high school calling to report that Clara's younger brother, Caleb, had gotten into another physical altercation with a classmate before the first bell. Clara sighed, promising to address the situation immediately after her shift. Moments later, her younger sister, Maya, walked into the kitchen, squinting through a pair of battered eyeglasses held together at the bridge by yellowing tape. "Clara, I really can't see the whiteboard anymore," Maya admitted quietly, wiping a smudge off the scratched lens. Clara looked at the bent frames, then glanced toward the corner of the counter, where the overdue utility bills and medical notices were stacked neatly under a paperweight. She knew down to the penny that her current checking account balance could not cover a new prescription this week. "Let me figure something out today, Maya," Clara promised, handing her a brown-bagged lunch. "We'll get it taken care of." After ensuring her mother took her blood pressure medication and verifying that Caleb had his textbooks packed, Clara grabbed her jacket and stepped out into the crisp mountain air. Only when the heavy oak door clicked shut behind her did she allow herself to stop. She leaned her forehead against the cool, weathered siding of the porch, closing her eyes as she let out a long, shuddering breath. For 30 seconds, she let the weight of her world press down without fighting it. Then she wiped her eyes, pulled her coat tight against the chilly breeze, and walked down the steps toward the bus stop. The scent of damp earth and pine needle rustle accompanied her 3-block walk toward the city line, where the suburban streets gave way to the brick facade of Mission Hospital. Asheville was waking up, its local diners turning on their neon open signs, while early morning commuters scraped frost off their windshields. Inside the bustling nurse's break room on the 4th floor, her closest co-worker, Brenda, was already waiting with 2 paper cups of steaming black coffee. "You look like you haven't slept in a week," Brenda said gently, pushing one of the cups across the laminate table. Clara took the coffee, feeling the heat penetrate her cold fingers. "Is it really that obvious?" she asked with a faint, weary laugh. Brenda pulled out a chair and sat down opposite her. "You can't fool me, Clara. Tell me what's going on." Clara hesitated for a second before laying out the reality of her week. Caleb's trouble at school, Maya's broken glasses, and the mountain of household expenses that seemed to grow higher with every passing month. Brenda listened intently, her expression turning somber. "You don't have to carry the entire sky by yourself, Clara," Brenda whispered, placing a steady hand over Clara's trembling wrist. "If you fall apart, who helps you?" Clara looked down at her hands, her nails trimmed short for clinical work. "If I stop moving, Brenda, the whole house collapses. I don't have the luxury of falling apart." Brenda squeezed her hand gently. "Then when the time comes, let someone help you hold up the structure." Clara didn't answer, but those words echoed in her mind as she spent the next 7 hours moving tirelessly from room to room, administering medications, checking vitals, and offering comfort to patients who were facing their own quiet storms. Yet, during a brief 10-minute break in the afternoon, Clara had to slip into the staff restroom, lock the door, and splash freezing water over her face to suppress the exhaustion that threatened to pull her under. Her day reached a breaking point when she arrived home that evening to find Mrs. Gable, their strict landlord, standing near the front porch stairs with an ominous white envelope in her hands. The elderly woman's face was set in stern lines as she handed Clara the formal notice. "I'm sorry, Clara," Mrs. Gable said, her voice devoid of malice but firm with financial reality. "I've been patient for 2 months, but taxes are due. If the back rent isn't settled in full within 48 hours, I have to initiate the eviction process." Clara held the thick paper, her fingers digging into the edges. "48 hours?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "That is all the grace period the management company allows me," Mrs. Gable replied before turning away down the paved walkway. Clara stood on the porch as the evening sun dipped behind the Blue Ridge Mountains, casting long shadows across the yard. She knew she could ask for another payroll advance, look for a cheaper apartment, or accept Brenda's standing offer of a temporary loan. But none of those paths were simple or guaranteed. She tucked the letter into her coat pocket, smoothed her scrub top, and opened the door to her family. The following morning, Clara arrived at Mission Hospital 15 minutes before her shift was scheduled to begin. The notice from Mrs. Gable sat heavy in her tote bag, an unexploded bomb waiting for a countdown she couldn't stop. As she was securing her hair back in the locker room, the floor supervisor, Evelyn Vance, stepped into the doorway holding a thick leather-bound medical chart. "Good morning, Clara," Evelyn said, her tone unusually serious. Clara turned around, adjusting her name tag. "Good morning, Evelyn. What do we have?" Evelyn closed the locker room door halfway to ensure privacy. "We have a high-profile admission in room 417. He arrived late last night via private transport, and so far he has refused to cooperate with 3 different attending nurses. He's demanding, hostile, and pushing everyone away. Frankly, you're the most patient nurse on this floor, and I need you to handle him." Clara took the heavy folder from Evelyn's hands and opened it. The name at the top of the demographic sheet was Arthur Montgomery, age 79. Clara recognized the name instantly from local business journals and regional news broadcasts. Arthur Montgomery was a titan of the American timber and real estate industries, a self-made billionaire who had spent 5 decades building an empire across the Pacific Northwest and the Southeast. He was a man accustomed to commanding boardrooms and reshaping skylines, a figure both revered for his immense philanthropy and feared for his unyielding temper. "How is his clinical status?" Clara asked, scanning the lab results and diagnostic scans. Evelyn lowered her voice. "End-stage pancreatic cancer. It has metastasized significantly. The oncology team estimates he has weeks, perhaps only days, depending on how his body holds up. He knows his diagnosis, and he knows there are no more aggressive interventions left to try." Clara looked up from the chart, her brow furrowing slightly. "Does he have any family listed for emergency contact or visitation?" Evelyn hesitated, a soft sigh escaping her lips. "The file lists no next of kin, no spouse, no children, no living siblings. No one has called, and no one has come by. He came in alone, accompanied only by his corporate attorney, who left as soon as the admission paperwork was signed." Clara felt a quiet ache in her chest at that revelation. She closed the leather binder with a soft thud. "I don't expect you to perform miracles with his attitude," Evelyn added gently. "Just make sure his pain management is maintained and that he stays comfortable." Clara nodded firmly. "I'll take care of him, Evelyn." The hallway leading to room 417 was noticeably quieter than the rest of the oncology wing. As Clara approached, she overheard two nursing assistants talking near the linen cart in low, stressed tones. "I went in there to take his morning vitals, and he practically threw the blood pressure cuff at me," one of them whispered, shaking her head. "He told me to get out and let him die in peace. Good luck to whoever gets assigned to that room next." Clara didn't let their words deter her. She approached the wooden door, raised her knuckles, and knocked twice with steady, even pressure. There was no answer from inside. She waited 5 seconds, knocked twice more, and then slowly turned the handle to push the door open. The hospital room was kept in near total darkness, the heavy blackout curtains drawn tightly against the morning sun. The air was cool and smelled faintly of antiseptic and neglected floral arrangements that had been left in the corner by hospital administration. Near the far window sat an elderly man in a high-backed armchair, his thin frame swallowed by a hospital gown and a dark blue wool sweater wrapped over his shoulders. His hair was stark white, thinned by age and illness, and his hands were clamped tightly over the brass head of an oak walking cane. His knuckles were prominent, his skin pale and translucent under the dim light. He did not turn his head as Clara entered. "If you're here to lecture me about taking those useless pills, save your breath and get out." His voice was raspy, dry, and sharp as a razor. Clara closed the door softly behind her, allowing the latch to click into place without making a loud sound. "Good morning, Mr. Montgomery," she said evenly, her voice calm and completely unbothered by his sharp tone. She set his medical chart down on the bedside table and stepped toward the wall controls, gently adjusting the thermostat to take the chill out of the room. Arthur Montgomery slowly turned his head, his deep-set gray eyes narrowing beneath bushy white eyebrows as he evaluated her. He looked for the usual signs he saw in healthcare workers: the nervous hesitation, the overly sweet customer service smile, or the clinical detachment of someone just trying to complete a checklist. He found none of those things in Clara's face. She looked tired, grounded, and entirely present. "You aren't listening," Arthur growled, his grip tightening on his cane. "I said I don't want anything." Clara walked to the small sink in the corner, washed her hands thoroughly, and dried them with a paper towel. "I heard you, Mr. Montgomery," she replied calmly, turning around to face him. "And I'm not here to lecture you about anything. I'm Clara, and I'll be taking care of you during the day shift." "See?" She picked up a fresh glass pitcher, filled it with cold water from the dispenser, and set it on the nightstand next to a clean plastic cup. "If you get thirsty later, the water is right here. If you don't touch it, it will still be here when I come back to check your intravenous line." Arthur stared at her, his stern expression flickering with a moment of mild surprise at her lack of defensive energy. He wasn't used to people failing to react to his irritation. "You're wasting your time," he muttered, turning his gaze back toward the tiny sliver of light peeking through the curtain seam. "I don't need a babysitter." Clara walked over to the curtain rod, reaching up with a deliberate motion. With your permission, I'm going to open these just a few inches. The sun is coming over the ridge, and it's easier to verify your IV sight when I have natural light. Before he could object, she pulled the fabric back slightly, allowing a warm beam of golden morning light to slice through the dim room, illuminating the quiet dust motes dancing in the air. Arthur flinched slightly at the sudden brightness, but he didn't bark at her this time. He watched out of the corner of his eye as Clara meticulously checked the IV pump hanging beside his bed, ensuring the clear pain management solution was flowing at the prescribed rate. Her hands were gentle, quick, and experienced. "Everyone who walks through that door thinks they know what's best for me," Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a heavy, ancient weariness. "They talk to me like I'm already a ghost or a child who can't make up his own mind." Clara paused, her hand lingering on the clear plastic tubing. She turned her head and met his sharp gray eyes directly. "You're right," she said quietly. "I don't know what you need, Mr. Montgomery. I just met you. But I do know that you're a human being in my care, and as long as I'm on duty, I will treat you with respect." Arthur opened his mouth to deliver another sharp retort, but the words seemed to catch in his dry throat. He looked at her closely, noting the faint, dark circles under her eyes and the unyielding strength in her posture. You have a lot of nerve for a floor nurse," he grumbled, though the sharp edge in his tone had perceptibly softened. Clara checked her wristwatch, noting the time on her chart sheet. "I'll be back in 2 hours to check your blood pressure. If you need anything before then, press the green button on your rail. It goes straight to my pocket device." She turned toward the exit, her hand on the brass handle. "You don't have to eat, and you don't have to talk to me, Mr. Montgomery, but you don't have to fight me either." As the door clicked shut behind Clara, Arthur Montgomery sat alone in the quiet room. He looked at the nightstand where the glass of clear water sat reflecting the thin beam of sunlight. For the first time in 3 days, he didn't feel the urge to yell at the walls. He slowly reached out a trembling, liver-spotted hand, picked up the plastic cup, and took a small, careful sip. The daily rhythm of room 417 began to shift over the next 3 days. Clara never forced conversation, nor did she enter the room with artificial cheerfulness. Every morning at 7 o'clock, she would knock twice, enter quietly, and attend to Arthur's clinical needs with methodical grace. On the third morning, carrying a tiny terracotta pot, no larger than her teacup, Clara placed a small, potted spruce seedling on the wide windowsill near Arthur's chair. Arthur, who was staring out at the hazy Blue Ridge skyline, watched her out of the corner of his eye. "What is that supposed to be?" he asked, his raspy voice breaking the quiet hum of the room's air filter. Clara adjusted the position of the tiny pot so it caught the morning light. "It's a Fraser fir seedling," she explained, smoothing her uniform apron. "My brother helped plant a few of them in our back garden last autumn. This room felt a little sterile, so I thought it could use something living." Arthur stared at the dark green needles of the tiny tree, his brow furrowing. "It's a sapling. It takes 20 years for a tree like that to grow into anything worth looking at." "I don't have 20 years." Clara turned around, her expression serene and unbothered. "No one has 20 years guaranteed, Mr. Montgomery. But the tree doesn't care about time. It just grows, because that's what it was made to do." Arthur went quiet, his eyes lingering on the tiny green plant. He didn't ask her to remove it. Later that afternoon, when Clara returned to check his intravenous line, she noticed he had turned his armchair slightly closer to the window, right beside the windowsill where the sapling sat. As she wrapped the blood pressure cuff around his thin upper arm, she began speaking softly about simple, grounded things. She spoke of how the dogwood trees were beginning to bud along the parkway, how the morning air in the mountains carried the crisp scent of damp earth, and how the local farmers were preparing their fields down in the valley. She asked for nothing in return, expecting no deep responses, merely offering a gentle stream of human life to fill the quiet void of the hospital room. On the fifth day, Clara brought a small, worn paperback book of American poetry and placed it on the corner of his bedside tray. "A patient left this in the waiting area weeks ago," she said casually, while organizing his daily oral medications. "No one ever claimed it. I thought you might like to flip through it if the television gets tiresome." Arthur glanced down at the battered cover. "I haven't read poetry since I was in college 70 years ago," he grumbled, though his fingers drifted toward the paper edges. "I spent my life reading financial balance sheets, legal contracts, and timber estimates. Poetry doesn't build highways or factories." Clara smiled faintly, picking up her medical tray. "No, it doesn't build factories," she agreed softly. "But sometimes it gives us words for the things we built those factories to escape from." When Clara returned to the room 2 hours later to record his vital signs, she found the paperback book open on Arthur's lap. He wasn't reading at that exact moment. His thumb was slowly tracing the yellowed margin of a page containing verses by Robert Frost. He didn't close the book when she walked in. "You have a subtle way of getting your point across, Nurse Vance," Arthur observed, his tone lacking its former harshness entirely. Clara offered a modest shrug as she checked the fluid levels in his IV bag. "I don't have a point to prove, Mr. Montgomery. I just want my patients to feel less like a diagnosis and more like themselves." Arthur looked up at her, his deep gray eyes searching her face, with an intensity that made the room feel suddenly smaller. "Why do you do this?" he asked softly. "Most of the staff here treat me like an impending administrative task. You treat me like I still belong in the world." Clara finished writing down his heart rate on her clipboard, pausing for a long moment before answering. She looked toward the window, where the sun was beginning its slow descent behind the purple mountain ridges. "Because being alone in a room with your own thoughts when you're facing the end is a heavy burden," she said, her voice dropping into a quiet, honest register. "My father died 3 years ago. He was alone in a hospital corridor when his heart gave out, because I was stuck in traffic on the interstate trying to get to him. I couldn't be there to hold his hand." She turned back to look Arthur in the eye, her posture straight and proud despite the pain in her words. "So, every time I walk into a room like this, I make sure my patients know that somebody sees them. Nobody should have to face the dark without a light in the room." Arthur stared at her, the deep lines around his mouth softening into an expression of profound, quiet sorrow. The air between them held no clinical boundary in that moment. It was simply two human beings recognizing the weight of loss in one another. "Your father was a rich man," Arthur whispered, his voice trembling slightly. Clara tilted her head, confused. "My father was a mechanic, Mr. Montgomery. He barely made $30,000 a year." Arthur shook his head slowly, his eyes shining with unspilled tears. "He was a rich man, Clara," he repeated gently, "because he raised a daughter who carries his memory with this much honor." The following morning, Clara found Arthur sitting upright in his chair before 6:30, well before her official shift had begun. The poetry book was closed on his lap, his fingers hooked tightly around the oak cane. He looked paler than the day before, his breathing shallower, but his eyes possessed a sharp, deliberate clarity that Clara had not seen since his admission. As she set down her clinical tray, he didn't offer his usual grumbled greeting. Instead, he motioned with a slight tilt of his head toward the visitor's chair beside his bed. "Sit down for a moment, Clara," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable authority. "Please." Clara hesitated, knowing the morning shift handoff was occurring down the hall, but something in Arthur's posture told her this moment could not be rescheduled. She pulled the wooden chair closer and sat down, meeting his gaze. "Is the pain worsening, Mr. Montgomery?" she asked softly. Arthur waved his hand dismissively. "The pain is what it is. I want to tell you something before my mind gets too clouded by the drugs they keep pushing through that tube." He took a slow, labored breath, his gray eyes fixing on the small Fraser fir seedling resting on the window ledge. "I had a daughter once," he began, his voice raspy with long suppressed emotion. "Her name was Elizabeth." Clara remained silent, giving him the full space of the room to speak. "She was 19 years old," Arthur continued, his fingers gripping the brass head of his cane until his knuckles turned paper white. "She loved the mountains. She loved old trees, cheap paperback novels, and walking through the woods behind our old house in Oregon. I, on the other hand, loved my company. I loved acquiring land, signing contracts, and outmaneuvering my competitors. When she was born, I had 20 employees. By the time she turned 18, I had over 2,000. He let out a harsh, self-deprecating laugh that ended in a soft cough. "I thought I was building an empire for her. I thought every $1,000,000 I added to the corporate balance sheet was proof of how much I loved her." He paused, his eyes closing as a deep shadow passed across his face. "One Tuesday morning in October, 35 years ago, she came into my office before I left for a board meeting in Seattle. She asked me if I could take the afternoon off to drive up into the Cascades with her to see the autumn leaves changing. She said we hadn't talked in months." Arthur opened his eyes, staring blankly at the far wall as if watching a film from another life. "I looked at my watch, handed her my credit card, and told her we would do it next month when my schedule cleared up. I told her I was doing it all for her future." He swallowed hard, his jaw quivering slightly. "She died that evening in an automobile accident on a wet mountain road. When the highway patrol called my office, I was still sitting in that board meeting, arguing over timber rights." Clara felt a profound ache in her heart as she watched the old billionaire crumble under the weight of a memory that 40 years of immense wealth had failed to erase. "Mr. Montgomery," she whispered gently. "I didn't get to say goodbye," Arthur continued, a single tear cutting a slow path down the deep creases of his weathered cheek. "When I got to the county morgue, she was already gone. I couldn't trade all my timber tracts, all my bank accounts, or all my influence for 5 minutes to tell her that I was sorry. I spent the next 35 years trying to bury that guilt under more work, more buildings, and more money. But when you get to a room like this, Clara, the money doesn't make any noise. The buildings don't keep you warm. You're just left alone with the choices you made." He turned his head to look directly at Clara, his tears reflecting the early morning sunlight. "I look at you every morning, Clara. I see you running yourself ragged, carrying the burden of your family, worrying about bills and rent. Yet you still walk into this cold room and offer kindness to an old man who gave you every reason to hate him. You remind me so much of Elizabeth. She had that same soft strength, that same refusal to let the world make her bitter." Clara reached out, placing her warm hand gently over his trembling, cold fingers. You don't have to carry that guilt anymore, Arthur," she said softly, using his first name for the very first time. "Elizabeth knew you loved her, even if you showed it through the wrong things." Arthur looked at her hand resting over his chest heaving with a deep, shaky breath. "I want to ask something of you, Clara," he said, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. Something selfish, perhaps. But I am an old man, with very little time left, and I have no right to be proud any more. Clara squeezed his fingers. What is it, Arthur? He looked at her with an intensity that filled the entire room. I want to spend one last day outside these walls. I want to smell the mountain air, look at the trees, sit in a park, and eat lunch without checking a heart monitor. I want to feel like a father taking his daughter out for an afternoon, just once, before I close my eyes for good. He paused, his lip trembling. Will you be my daughter for just one day, Clara? Clara sat entirely motionless as the request hung in the quiet room. She thought of her landlord's eviction notice sitting in her bag, her brother's troubled path at school, her sister's broken glasses, and the father she had lost 3 years ago without a chance to say goodbye. She looked into Arthur's desperate, weary eyes and saw not a billionaire, but a grieving father seeking a moment of redemption at the end of a long, lonely road. Yes, Arthur, Clara whispered, her eyes shining with tears. I would be honored to spend the day with you. Saturday morning arrived with an unclouded, brilliant blue sky over the Blue Ridge Mountains. The crisp October air carried the distinct, sharp fragrance of fallen pine needles, damp earth, and distant wood smoke. For the first time since his emergency admission, Arthur Montgomery allowed the nursing staff to assist him into a freshly pressed woolen blazer, dark trousers, and a pair of polished leather shoes. The process was physically exhausting for his frail frame. He had to pause twice to lean heavily against the bed frame to regain his breath, but his eyes burned with a stubborn, quiet determination. The hospital medical director had granted a 4-hour excursion pass under the strict condition that Arthur remain in a lightweight transport wheelchair for any distance exceeding 20 yards, and that Clara carry a mobile emergency medical kit at all times. Remember, Nurse Vance, Evelyn had warned Clara at the nurse's station before they left. His blood pressure is volatile. At the first sign of respiratory distress or extreme fatigue, you bring him back immediately. Clara nodded, adjusting the strap of the medical kit over her shoulder. I understand, Evelyn. I'll take care of him. Arthur, sitting in the wheelchair with a plaid wool blanket draped over his knees, tapped his oak cane against the floor. Stop fussing, Evelyn, he said with a faint trace of his old corporate authority. Today I'm taking my orders from my daughter. They stepped out through the hospital's main glass doors just past 10 o'clock in the morning. The cool mountain air hit Arthur's face, and he closed his eyes, tilting his head back to absorb the natural light. He took a long, deep breath that ended in a soft sigh. 35 years, he murmured, opening his eyes as Clara pushed the wheelchair smoothly along the paved walkway. 35 years, since I just sat outside without a schedule. They traveled down toward the historic district of Asheville, where the brick sidewalks were lined with red oaks and sugar maples displaying brilliant shades of amber, crimson, and gold. Street musicians played folk tunes on acoustic guitars near the square, and the scent of freshly roasted coffee drifted from small local cafes. At the entrance to the botanical gardens near the river, Arthur asked to stand. Clara locked the wheelchair brakes immediately, extending her arm to offer support. Arthur took her arm, his thin hand gripping her sleeve with surprising firmness, and together they walked at a slow, deliberate pace down a gravel path bounded by towering mountain hemlocks and wild rhododendron bushes. Elizabeth loved hemlocks, Arthur said quietly, looking up at the high canopy where sunlight filtered through the green needles in soft, golden rays. She used to gather the tiny cones and keep them in a glass jar on her desk. Clara adjusted the wool scarf around his neck, ensuring the chilly mountain wind didn't catch his chest. They're strong trees, Clara said softly. They survive the hardest winters. Arthur looked at her, his expression filled with a gentle warmth. So do you, Clara. So do you. After walking 50 yards, Arthur's strength began to flag, his steps growing heavy and uncertain. Clara helped him ease back into the wheelchair before he could push himself past his physical limits. No point in fighting gravity today, Arthur admitted with a soft, breathy laugh, resting his hands on his cane. We aren't racing anyone. Right. They continued along the paved park path until they reached an old wooden bench situated beneath a massive white oak overlooking the rushing waters of the French Broad River. Clara parked the wheelchair beside the bench and sat down next to him, wrapping her own coat tightly against the autumn breeze. They sat in comfortable silence for a long time, watching the clear water ripple over smooth river stones while fallen leaves floated downstream like miniature red canoes. I used to think my legacy was the timber company, Arthur said, his voice barely louder than the murmur of the river. I spent 50 years making sure my name was carved into corporate boards and land deeds across 5 states. But sitting here today, I realize that none of that matters. A man's true legacy isn't what he builds out of stone or wood. It's the warmth he leaves behind in the hearts of the people who knew him. He turned his head to look at Clara, his gray eyes clear and tranquil. I spent 40 years living in a cold house, Clara. Thank you for bringing me back into the light. Around noon, they stopped at a small, family-owned ice cream parlor near the edge of the park. Clara went inside and returned with 2 small paper cups, vanilla bean for herself and a single scoop of tart lemon sorbet for Arthur. Arthur looked down at the pale yellow scoop and chuckled softly. Lemon sorbet was Elizabeth's absolute favorite, he said, taking a tiny spoon and tasting it carefully. It's far too sour, he declared, though a broad, genuine smile spread across his wrinkled face. Then why did you order it? Clara asked with a soft laugh. Arthur looked up at the golden maple leaves above them. Because today isn't about what's easy or sensible. It's about remembering what mattered. Before heading back toward the hospital vehicle, they passed a small local bookstore with displays of local poetry and history volumes in the front window. Arthur insisted on stopping. He asked Clara to take his leather wallet from his jacket pocket and purchase a small, hand-bound collection of mountain poetry written by a regional author. Inside the front cover, using a pen provided by the cashier, Arthur's trembling hand wrote a short, elegant inscription. He handed the book to Clara, refusing to let her decline it. A gift isn't a debt, Clara, he said firmly when she hesitated. It's a bridge between 2 people. Keep it. As they walked past a boutique shop down the street, Arthur's eyes caught a knitted emerald green wool scarf displayed on a mannequin. That one too, he insisted. Clara smiled, shaking her head. Arthur, you've already bought the book. He looked at her with a mock stern glare. I am 79 years old, Nurse Vance, and today I am your father. Fathers are allowed to buy their daughters a scarf when the mountain wind picks up. Do not argue with me. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the pale color had faded entirely from Arthur's face, and his breathing had grown heavy and rattled. Clara recognized the unmistakable signs of acute physical exhaustion. It's time to head back, Dad, she said gently, laying a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Arthur didn't argue this time. He leaned his head back against the wheelchair headrest, his eyelids heavy. As Clara wheeled him toward the waiting transport van, Arthur reached up, his cool, frail hand finding hers where it rested on the push handle. He squeezed her fingers with every ounce of remaining strength he possessed. Can I ask you one last thing, Clara? He whispered, his voice hoarse and faint against the mountain wind. Clara leaned down close to his face. Anything, Arthur." He looked into her eyes with a profound, peaceful tenderness. "Call me Dad. Just one more time." Clara felt a warm tear slip down her cheek, catching the autumn wind as she leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to his weathered forehead. She thought of her father sleeping beneath the mountain soil, and she thought of the lonely old man who had spent 40 years searching for forgiveness. "Thank you for today, Dad," Clara whispered from the absolute depths of her heart. "Thank you for being my father." Arthur closed his eyes, a soft, beautiful smile settling over his lips as his fingers relaxed in hers. "Thank you, my sweet girl," he murmured softly into the quiet air. "Thank you for bringing me home." The following morning, Clara arrived at Mission Hospital 15 minutes before 7, her heart carrying a strange, heavy stillness. She walked down the quiet corridor of the 4th floor, carrying the tiny terracotta Fraser fir seedling she had brought days ago, intending to check its soil moisture. When she reached room 417, the door was slightly ajar. The blackout curtains were pulled back completely, allowing the brilliant morning sunlight to illuminate the entire room. Arthur Montgomery lay peacefully in his bed, his hands folded neatly across his chest over the dark blue wool sweater. His expression was completely serene, devoid of the pain, anger, and weariness that had marked his features for so long. Clara stepped into the room, setting the tiny spruce sapling down on the bedside table. She approached the bed, reached out with a trembling hand, and gently placed 2 fingers against his wrist. There was no pulse. The room was entirely quiet, filled only with the soft rustle of the morning wind against the window glass. Clara stood there for a long moment, allowing her tears to fall freely without trying to stop them. She leaned down, smoothed his white hair back from his forehead, and whispered a quiet prayer of thanksgiving for the quiet peace he had finally found. On the nightstand, resting beside the paperback poetry book, was a heavy manila envelope with her name written across the front in Arthur's distinct, elegant handwriting. By noon, the news of Arthur Montgomery's passing had circulated through the administrative offices of Mission Hospital and regional media outlets. The wealthy industrialist had passed away quietly in his sleep, surrounded not by corporate board members or legal teams, but in the quiet warmth of a hospital room bathed in autumn sunlight. As Clara was completing her administrative notes in the staff lounge, she opened the manila envelope Arthur had left behind. Inside was a single sheet of ivory stationery, along with a certified legal document bearing the seal of his primary estate attorney. "Dearest Clara," the letter began in Arthur's sharp, decisive penmanship, "if you are reading this, my journey has finally come to its natural end. For over 35 years, I lived under the foolish delusion that money could repair the damages of a neglected life. I thought wealth was a shield against grief and a substitute for presence. I was wrong. No fortune on earth can buy back a single missed breakfast, nor can it purchase a single moment of genuine love. On our Saturday together, you gave me the greatest gift a dying man could ever receive. You didn't see my balance sheets, my corporate title, or my difficult past. You simply saw a father who needed to be forgiven, and you allowed me to walk through the light one last time. You reminded me that love is not something we earn through achievement, but something we share through grace." Included with this letter is a copy of an amendment made to my personal estate trust 3 days ago. I have directed my executors to establish the Elizabeth and Clara Vance Foundation, a permanent charitable trust dedicated to providing housing assistance, medical care, and educational funding for working families facing financial hardship in Western North Carolina. The foundation will be fully funded in perpetuity, and I have named you as its perpetual community director, with a permanent salary that will ensure your family never again faces the threat of eviction or unpaid bills. Do not feel burdened by this gift, Clara. It is not a payment for your kindness. Kindness like yours cannot be bought. It is simply a tool, placed in the hands of someone who knows how to use it to heal others. Take care of your mother. Help your brother find his path. Buy your sister her new glasses. And remember to let others carry the structure for you when your shoulders get tired. With all my eternal love and gratitude, Dad. Clara pressed the paper against her chest, her shoulders shaking as she wept silent, cleansing tears in the quiet break room. Brenda walked in moments later, saw Clara holding the letter, and immediately wrapped her arms around her friend, holding her steady, as the heavy burden Clara had carried for 3 long years finally melted away into profound relief. 2 weeks later, a modest memorial service was held in a quiet chapel overlooking the Blue Ridge Mountains. Corporate executives, local civic leaders, and former employees attended, filling the pews with quiet respect. Clara sat near the back with her mother Sarah, her brother Caleb, who had enrolled in a vocational mentorship program funded by the new foundation, and her sister Maya, wearing crisp new eyeglasses that allowed her to see the world with perfect clarity. When the service concluded, Clara walked out into the crisp afternoon air, wearing the emerald green wool scarf Arthur had bought her. In the spring that followed, Clara, her family, and Brenda gathered on a quiet, sunlit knoll in the botanical gardens near the French Broad River. Together, they planted the small Fraser fir seedling that had sat on Arthur's hospital windowsill. Caleb shoveled the rich mountain soil around the roots. Maya watered the earth from a small metal can, and Sarah sat on a nearby wooden bench, watching her children with tears of joyful contentment in her eyes. At the base of the young tree, Clara placed a small, polished granite marker, engraved with simple words, "For Elizabeth and Arthur Montgomery, for the time that never returns, and the love that never leaves." The cool mountain wind rustled through the dark green needles of the young fir tree as Clara stood beside it, holding her family close. She took a deep, clear breath of the pine-scented air, looking up at the majestic blue peaks stretching endlessly toward the horizon. She knew that life would still bring its storms, its quiet hardships, and its unexpected turns, but she no longer feared the road ahead. She had learned that no matter how deep the grief or how long the guilt, love always finds a way to build a bridge back home. Life has a way of teaching us its most profound lessons, not in the noise of our greatest achievements, but in the quiet moments we so often overlook. So many of us spend our finest years chasing goals that seem impossibly urgent, climbing professional ladders, accumulating security, and measuring our worth by the tangible structures we build. We convince ourselves that we are doing it for the people we love, promising that once we reach the next milestone, we will finally slow down, pick up the phone, sit at the dinner table, and offer our full, undivided presence. But time is a silent river that never flows backward, and the tragedy of human existence is how often we realize the true value of a moment only after it has transformed into a memory. Arthur Montgomery possessed everything the world tells us to strive for: immense wealth, absolute influence, and a legacy carved into the very landscape of the country. Yet, when he reached the final quiet room of his life, none of those achievements could offer him warmth, comfort, or peace. What he craved in his final hours was not another corporate victory, but the simple, unscripted beauty of a shared afternoon, a cup of sour ice cream, the smell of autumn leaves, the sound of the wind through the trees, and the healing presence of a daughter's love. Clara, despite having almost nothing in terms of material wealth, possessed the one currency that money could never purchase: the willingness to be present, to show compassion without expectation, and to offer her heart to a stranger who needed grace. Her quiet act of kindness reminds us that it is never too late to repair a broken spirit, to offer forgiveness, or to choose love over bitterness. We cannot alter the choices of our past, nor can we bring back the loved ones who have already crossed the horizon. But we hold absolute power over the present moment. We can choose today to put down our schedules, put away our distractions, and look into the eyes of the people who walk beside us. We can choose to say the words of appreciation we have kept locked inside, to extend a hand to someone who is hurting, and to remember that our true worth is measured entirely by the love we leave behind in the lives of others. Before you return to the rush of your day, take a quiet moment to think of someone in your own life who might be waiting for a call, an embrace, or a simple word of grace. Do not wait for tomorrow is a promise no one holds. Reach out today, speak from your heart, and remember that the greatest legacy any human being can leave behind is simply the love they chose not to withhold.